Hey, welcome back. If you've ever wondered what it was actually like to be a cowboy in the 1870s, not the Hollywood version, not the romanticized version, but the real, muddy, exhausting, occasionally terrifying version, then you're in exactly the right place today, because we're going back, way back, to a time when the American West was still being figured out, when the economy of an entire nation was being shaped by men on horseback, and when one trail, roughly 800 miles of dirt, grass, river crossings, and open sky, became the backbone of American beef. We're talking about the Chisholm Trail. And today, I want to tell you this story the way it deserves to be told. Not as a dusty history lesson, but as a lived experience. Think of it as sitting around a campfire and hearing it from someone who was actually there. So grab a coffee, get comfortable, and let's ride. To understand why the Chisholm Trail existed, you have to understand the situation America found itself in right after the Civil War. It's 1865. The war is over. The South is devastated economically. Infrastructure is destroyed. Banks are broke. Farms are ruined. And hundreds of thousands of men are coming home to a country that doesn't quite know what to do with them yet. But in Texas, something interesting is happening. While the men were away fighting, the longhorn cattle population had exploded. These animals had been roaming free across the Texas plains for years, largely unchecked, breeding without anyone managing them. By some estimates, there were somewhere between 3 and 6 million longhorn cattle wandering across Texas by the end of the war. Maybe more. And here's the thing. In Texas, those cattle were worth almost nothing. Maybe $3 or $4 a head. The local market was saturated. There was no real infrastructure to process them. Nobody had the money to buy beef in a region that was still trying to rebuild from years of conflict. But up north, in the cities of Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, and beyond, beef was scarce, and people were hungry, and a steer that was worth $4 in Texas could fetch $40, sometimes more, in the northern markets. You see where this is going? All someone needed to do was figure out how to get several thousand cattle from the open ranges of Texas to the railheads in Kansas, where they could be loaded onto trains and shipped east. That's the whole idea. Simple in concept. Absolutely brutal in execution. Now, here's a fun detail that tends to surprise people. The Chisholm Trail wasn't originally designed for cattle drives at all. Jesse Chisholm was a half-Scottish, half-Cherokee trader and guide who operated across the Indian Territory, the region we now call Oklahoma. In the mid-1860s, he used a route through this territory to transport goods by wagon between trading posts. The path he wore into the land became well known among native peoples and traders alike. After Chisholm died in 1868, actually before the trail named after him really took off as a cattle route, Texas cattlemen started using his established path as the northern portion of their route. They connected it to trails leading up from South Texas, and just like that, a trade route became something much bigger. It's worth pausing on that. Jesse Chisholm never drove a single longhorn up that trail. He was a trader, a negotiator, a man who built bridges between different cultures on the frontier, and yet his name became synonymous with one of the most iconic eras in American history. History has a way of doing that, attaching names to things in unexpected ways. The full Chisholm Trail, as it came to be used during the cattle drive era, ran roughly from the ranches of South Texas, through San Antonio, north through Austin, up through the Red River crossing at what's now Red River Station, through Indian Territory, and on up to Abilene, Kansas, where Joseph McCoy had established a proper cattle shipping yard, starting in 1867. That's your route, about 800 miles, give or take, depending on where exactly you started and which variations you took along the way. Before we start walking the trail, let's talk about the people doing the walking. Because when most people picture a cowboy from the 1870s, they probably picture a certain image. Rugged white guy, maybe some stubble, riding tall in the saddle, hat perfectly shaped, maybe a cigar. And while that image existed, it was far from the whole picture. A significant portion, some historians estimate anywhere from a quarter to a third, of the cowboys who worked the Chisholm Trail era cattle drives were black men. Many of them were formerly enslaved people who had learned cattle and horse skills while in bondage on southern ranches. After emancipation, they brought those skills to the open-range economy, where a man's ability to ride and rope mattered more than most other things. There were also a substantial number of Mexican vaqueros. In fact, the very word cowboy and essentially every piece of equipment and technique associated with the job, the saddle design, the lasso, the way cattle were herded, all of it derived from the vaquero tradition that had been developing in Mexico and what's now Texas and California for over a century before the trail drive era. Then there were Anglo-American men, many of them young. Very young, actually. It wasn't unusual for trail hands to be teenagers, 16 or 17 years old, taking on work that would be considered demanding for a grown adult. And then there were Native American cowboys, mixed-race men, and immigrants from various parts of Europe who had come west looking for work and opportunity. The trail drive was, in many ways, one of the more genuinely diverse workplaces of 19th century America. That doesn't mean it was some kind of racial utopia. It absolutely wasn't, and the racial hierarchies of the time showed up in who got paid what, who got hired as trail boss, and how people were treated. But the practical reality of working cattle meant that skill and reliability were valued in ways that cut across some of those barriers. So imagine you're a young man in South Texas in, say, 1873. Maybe you grew up around cattle. Maybe you worked on your family's small ranch, or maybe you worked for someone else. You've ridden horses your whole life. You know how to rope. You know the basics of handling cattle. And you've heard that there's money to be made on a trail drive north. How do you get hired? You'd show up. That's pretty much it. You'd go to wherever a trail boss was putting together a crew. You'd demonstrate that you could ride and handle cattle. And if he liked what he saw, you'd have a job. Pay for a regular cowhand during this era was roughly $25 to $40 a month. Trail bosses made more. Maybe $100 a month or even slightly higher. A cook, and we'll get to the cook, because the cook was one of the most important people on the drive, might earn similar wages to a trail boss, given how essential the role was. Before you left, there were things you needed. A good horse? Actually, several horses. Trail outfits typically provided a remuda, a herd of spare horses, so each cowboy would have access to multiple mounts throughout the drive. You'd use different horses for different tasks, rotating them to prevent exhaustion. You needed your saddle, your bedroll, your slicker for when it rained, your rope. Some men brought their own weapons, though the trail outfits sometimes provided firearms as well. Your personal gear had to be minimal because everything had to fit in that bedroll or in the limited space on the Chuck Wagon. The Chuck Wagon, by the way, was another innovation of this era. It's credited to cattleman Charles Goodnight, who in the mid-1860s took an old army wagon and redesigned it with a box at the back containing drawers and compartments for food, cooking equipment, and basic medical supplies. The Chuck Wagon became the rolling headquarters of every trail drive, the place where the crew ate, where the coffee was always waiting, and where some sense of normalcy was maintained across hundreds of miles of open country. A typical trail drive herd during the peak Chisholm Trail years, roughly 1867 to the mid-1880s, numbered somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 cattle. Some drives pushed larger numbers, but that was the general range that a competent crew could manage. Managing that many animals is genuinely hard to picture if you haven't spent time around cattle. These weren't docile dairy cows. Texas longhorns were semi-wild animals, tough and ornery and unpredictable, with horn spreads that could reach 5 or 6 feet across. They could be aggressive when threatened, and they had a strong instinct to return to familiar territory. A herd of 2,000 longhorns on the move stretched for roughly a mile on open ground. The lead cattle at the front of that column were often the same animals day after day, individual steers who naturally took the front position and set the pace. Cowboys learned their herds well. They knew the personalities of individual animals, which ones were likely to bolt, which ones were steady, which ones the others would follow. The crew positions during a drive were specific and well-defined. Up at the front, riding alongside the lead cattle, were the point riders. Usually the most experienced hands, they set the direction and pace and kept the herd from drifting off course. Behind them came the swing riders, one on each side of the herd, keeping the middle portion from spreading out too far. Further back were the flank riders, doing similar work for the rear portion of the herd. And then at the very back, eating every bit of dust that 2,000 cattle could kick up, were the drag riders. This was the worst position on the drive, and it was usually given to the youngest and least experienced cowboys. The drag was where the slowest cattle ended up. The sick ones, the weak ones, the young ones. And keeping them moving required constant work and patience. If you were new, you rode drag, and you hated it. Let me walk you through what an actual day on the trail looked like. You woke up before the sun. That wasn't a preference. That was the schedule. The cook had usually been up for an hour already, and by the time the first gray light appeared in the east, there was coffee and food ready. Beans, biscuits, sometimes salt pork, maybe dried fruit if you were lucky. The food was simple and calorie-dense because you were going to need every one of those calories. You ate fast, and you saddled your horse for the morning. The herd was started moving by sunrise. In good conditions, on open flat land with decent grass and water, a drive could cover 15 to 20 miles in a day. That sounds like a lot until you realize that some days, under difficult conditions, you might only cover 5 or 6 miles. Crossing rivers, dealing with storms, managing a spooked herd, all of these things ate time and distance. The cattle set the pace. You didn't push them too hard because you needed them to arrive in Kansas in sellable condition, well-fed and healthy, not run ragged and thin. So the pace was a walk, a slow, steady, miles-eating walk. By midday, the heat in Texas and Oklahoma could be severe. The herd might be stopped near water if possible, allowed to graze and drink for a few hours during the worst of the afternoon heat. Cowboys not on watch could sleep, and they took that opportunity seriously because sleep was limited. Night watches were rotated. 2 or 3 men at a time would circle the resting herd through the night, riding slowly around the perimeter, keeping watch for anything that might spook the cattle. They often sang or hummed, not for fun exactly, but because the sound of a human voice actually seemed to calm cattle. The cattle knew where their people were, and hearing familiar voices kept them settled. That night watch rotation meant that even when you weren't riding watch, your sleep was broken. You might get 3 or 4 hours before your shift, then another couple hours after. It added up, but never quite felt like enough. Here's something the movies consistently underplay: the weather. Texas and Oklahoma weather in the spring and early summer, which is when most trail drives ran, can be extreme, and I mean that word seriously. Thunderstorms on the southern plains are not like thunderstorms in most other places. They come fast, they hit hard, and they produce lightning that lights up the entire sky in ways that are genuinely spectacular and genuinely terrifying at the same time. And lightning spooked cattle. A stampede caused by a lightning storm was one of the most dangerous situations a cowboy could face. 2,000 panicked longhorns moving at full speed in the dark, in the rain, with lightning flashing overhead. That's a nightmare by any definition. Men died in stampedes. They were thrown from their horses, or their horses fell, or the herd simply overwhelmed them. Preventing a stampede meant riding toward the herd the moment you sensed they were getting nervous. It meant making noise, maintaining that human presence the cattle had come to associate with safety. It meant trying to get the leaders to circle, what was called milling the herd. so that instead of running in a straight line, they started moving in a circle that gradually tightened and slowed. Experienced cowboys became very good at reading their herds. They knew what a nervous herd sounded like versus a settled one. They knew which animals were early indicators of trouble. They developed instincts that are hard to explain and harder to teach. But the weather wasn't just about storms. Spring on the trail meant unpredictable everything. Cold snaps that dropped temperatures back below freezing even in April. Hailstorms that came out of nowhere. High winds that made keeping the herd together harder. And rain. Significant, sustained rain that turned trail sections into mud wallows and swelled every river on the route. The rivers were their own category of problem. There were multiple significant river crossings on the Chisholm Trail. The Red River, which formed the boundary between Texas and the Indian Territory, was one of the most significant. Then there were the various rivers of Oklahoma, the Canadian, the North Canadian, the Cimarron, the Arkansas, and finally the Kansas streams before reaching Abilene. Crossing a river with 2,000 longhorn cattle was a logistical and sometimes dangerous operation that required planning and nerve. First, you had to find a suitable crossing point, ideally a place where the banks weren't too steep, where the bottom was firm enough that cattle wouldn't sink, and where the channel wasn't so deep or fast that swimming cattle would lose ground against the current. Cowboys who knew the trail well knew the good crossings. But conditions changed with rainfall, and what was an easy ford one season might be a dangerous swimming crossing the next. The technique was to push the lead cattle into the water and trust that the rest would follow. Cattle had a strong instinct to follow other cattle, which was either your greatest tool or your greatest problem depending on the situation. You got the lead steer swimming, you kept the herd moving into the water from behind, and you had riders on horseback in the river, swimming their horses, keeping the herd aimed at the far bank. Cattle that panicked in the water were dangerous. A swimming longhorn could drown itself, or more concerning, it could turn back and create a tangled mass of animals fighting the current and each other. Cowboys drowned on river crossings. It happened. The accounts are matter-of-fact about it in ways that tell you a great deal about how people processed risk in that era. The Chuck Wagon crossing was its own ordeal. The wagon had to be waterproofed as best as possible. The cook's supplies and the crew's gear could not get soaked. Sometimes the wheels were removed and the wagon body floated across. Sometimes it was pulled through a shallow crossing by extra horses. It required creativity and muscle and occasionally some colorful language. After crossing the Red River, the trail entered what was called the Indian Territory, the region of present-day Oklahoma that had been designated as homeland for the 5 civilized tribes and various other native nations relocated from the eastern United States during the forced removal policies of earlier decades. This is an aspect of the trail drive story that deserves honest treatment. The cattle drives were passing through land that belonged to sovereign native nations. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations all had legal sovereignty over various portions of this territory, and the constant passage of large cattle herds, which damaged grass, contaminated water sources, and disrupted local farming, was a legitimate grievance. The nations had the legal right to charge tolls for passage. Many trail drives paid these tolls. A fee per head of cattle was common. Some paid in beef, leaving cattle behind as payment. Relations between trail crews and native peoples were complicated and varied enormously. Some interactions were friendly and involved trade, fresh food, and information about conditions ahead. Others were tense. Some were outright hostile, with cattle being taken or drives being turned back. The cowboys' own accounts of these interactions reflect the attitudes of their era, which were often prejudiced in ways that modern readers recognize easily. But the factual reality was that these drives were passing through sovereign territory, and the nations through whose land they passed had every reason to regulate that passage. It's worth sitting with that complexity rather than smoothing it over. Here's something that gets lost in the action-focused telling of the cattle drive story. Most of it was profoundly ordinary. Miles and miles and miles of walking beside cattle that were walking. The same scenery, slowly changing. The same faces around the campfire every night. The same food. The same routine. Day after day after day. The trail from deep South Texas to Abilene took roughly 3 months under normal conditions. Sometimes longer. That's 3 months of the same routine, the same people, the same work. Cowboys found ways to pass the time. Card games around the campfire. Storytelling. Music. Many trail drives had at least 1 or 2 musicians among the crew, and an evening with a fiddle or a harmonica was genuinely valued. Reading was less common but not absent. Some men carried books or newspapers, read and reread until the pages fell apart. Conversation covered everything from women back home to politics to arguments about the best way to do any given task. Cowboys, like people in any close-knit working environment, developed strong opinions about small things simply because small things were what filled the days. There was also a significant amount of humor. The accounts that survive from trail drive participants are often funnier than people expect. Practical jokes, nicknames, the kind of dark comedy that emerges when people are doing hard, dangerous work together and need to keep things light. The cook was often the center of trail drive social life. Not just because food was so important, but because the cook's domain, the area around the Chuck Wagon, was the gathering point, the warm spot, the place where the day began and ended. A good cook was valued beyond their cooking skills. They kept morale up. They had medical supplies and basic medical knowledge. They often served as a kind of informal counselor, the person who knew what was going on with every member of the crew. A bad cook could poison morale as effectively as bad weather. Let's talk about the longhorns for a moment, because they deserve recognition as participants in this story, rather than just cargo. The Texas longhorn is a remarkable animal. It descends from cattle brought to the Americas by Spanish explorers in the 1490s and 1500s, which then evolved over centuries of life on the open range in what is now Texas and northern Mexico. Natural selection over all those generations produced an animal superbly adapted to the harsh conditions of the southern plains. Longhorns could go longer between water sources than other cattle breeds. They were resistant to tick fever and other diseases that devastated more domesticated cattle. They could survive on grass that other cattle wouldn't thrive on. They were tough in ways that were directly relevant to surviving an 800-mile walk. They were also fast, faster than you might expect from cattle. And those horns were genuine weapons that demanded respect. Working closely with longhorns required awareness at all times. A veteran hand moved around cattle in particular ways, positioning themselves to avoid being on the wrong end of a horn swing. The relationship between the cowboys and the cattle was practical, but not without something that might cautiously be called familiarity. Spending 3 months with the same animals, watching them every day, riding night watch around them under the stars. You learned those animals. You knew which ones were trouble and which ones were steady. You had opinions about them. When the drive ended and the cattle were sold, there was often a period of strange quiet. The constant noise and movement of 2,000 cattle was simply gone, and the silence was its own kind of disorientation. The Chisholm Trail wasn't entirely open country. There were small settlements and communities along the route, and for a trail crew that had been weeks in the wilderness, even a modest collection of buildings felt like civilization. These trail towns offered supplies, whiskey, tobacco, canned goods, ammunition. They offered information about conditions ahead, and they offered, occasionally, entertainment and rest. The interaction between trail crews and trail town communities was often tense. Trail drives represented money. The cowboys were customers, and a large drive passing through meant business, but they also represented disruption. A group of young men who had been weeks on the trail with money in their pockets and a day or two of freedom were not always the most orderly guests. The reputation of cowboys in these communities was complicated. Some townspeople saw them as essential to the regional economy and treated them accordingly. Others saw them as troublemakers, to be tolerated at best. The trail boss held an unusual position. On the trail, their authority was essentially absolute. Decisions about route, about pace, about how to handle any given crisis fell on the trail boss. A good trail boss needed to be an experienced cattleman, a competent leader of people, and a level-headed problem solver. They also needed to be someone the crew would actually follow, which wasn't given, it was earned. A trail boss who lost the respect of their crew in the middle of Indian Territory with 2,000 cattle had a serious problem. The trail boss typically rode ahead of the herd each day, scouting the route. They were looking for grass conditions. You needed the herd to have grass to graze, and you needed to plan your days around where the grass was good. They were looking for water sources and river conditions. They were looking for anything that might affect the day's progress. This scouting role meant the trail boss often knew the land ahead intimately after a few seasons on the trail. They had mental maps of where the water was, where the good camping spots were, where the river crossings were easiest. That knowledge was valuable and hard to replace. When things went wrong, and things went wrong, the trail boss was the one making calls under pressure. A river in flood, a stampede, illness among the crew or the cattle, confrontations with other parties. Every decision had consequences, and the boss carried them. Abilene, Kansas, the destination. If you'd spent 3 months walking through Texas heat and Oklahoma storms and river crossings and sleepless nights on watch, arriving in Abilene was something. Joseph McCoy had established Abilene as a cattle shipping point in 1867, recognizing the opportunity that existed if he could create a reliable connection between the Texas cattle supply and the eastern markets. He built stockyards, hotels, saloons, and other facilities specifically to service the trade. He actively promoted the town to Texas cattlemen. And it worked. During the peak years, Abilene received enormous numbers of cattle. In 1871 alone, somewhere around 700,000 cattle came up the Chisholm Trail to Abilene. The town became genuinely wealthy on the trade. For the cowboys arriving after months on the trail, Abilene was many things. It was the place where the job ended and they got paid. It was a place with beds and hot baths and food they hadn't cooked themselves. It was a place with saloons and gambling and the company of people who hadn't been staring at the same faces for 3 months. The reputation of Abilene as a wild cattle town has been amplified by decades of storytelling, but it wasn't entirely invented. The combination of young men, hard months of work, and cash money created predictable outcomes. There was drinking, gambling, fighting, and the various other activities that attended these pastimes. Wild Bill Hickok served as town marshal of Abilene in 1871, which tells you something about the town's reputation and the scale of law enforcement challenge it represented. But the wildness was seasonal. Abilene was a cattle town during drive season and a quiet agricultural community the rest of the year. The permanent residents had complicated feelings about the trade that made their town prosperous but also chaotic. So after 3 months on the trail, what did a cowboy actually have to show for it? At $25 to $40 a month for 3 months, a regular hand might have earned $75 to $120 for a single drive. That's not nothing. In the 1870s context, that was meaningful money. A working man in a city might earn comparable wages over the same period, but without the particular hardships of the trail. The problem was what happened to the money in Abilene. The accounts suggest that a significant portion of trail wages were spent in Abilene before the cowboys headed home. Saloons, gambling, various forms of entertainment. The town was designed to capture those earnings, and it was effective at doing so. Some men were more careful. Some saved money, sent it home, used it to start their own operations eventually. But the image of the cowboy blowing 3 months' wages in 3 days had more than a little truth to it. And after the money was gone, You either found another drive heading south, as many did, working the trail in both directions for different outfits, or you made your way back to Texas by whatever means were available and started looking for the next season's work. We've talked about stampedes and river crossings. Let me talk about a few other dangers that don't get as much attention. Snake bites were a genuine hazard. The southern plains were, and are, home to rattlesnakes and men working close to the ground, rolling out bedrolls in the dark, stepping through tall grass, were at real risk. The treatment available at the time was limited. A bad bite far from any town could be fatal. Disease was probably a bigger killer overall than any of the dramatic dangers. Dysentery, typhoid from contaminated water, fevers of various kinds. These moved through trail crews and were particularly dangerous precisely because there was no good way to get medical attention in the middle of Indian Territory. The cook's basic medical kit was often the only resource available. Getting lost was a real possibility in the era before GPS or even reliable maps of the territory. The established trail had markers and known landmarks, but in bad weather or at night, disorientation was easy. Cowboys occasionally separated from the herd or the crew and had genuine difficulty finding their way back. Horse injuries were common, both for riders and horses. A horse that stepped in a prairie dog hole at speed was a potential disaster. The horse might break a leg. The rider might be thrown and injured. Working cowboys spent so much time on horseback that the cumulative physical toll was significant. Saddle sores, back problems, knee and hip issues from thousands of miles in the saddle. These added up over years of trail driving work. And then there was the loneliness. This one is harder to document, but shows up in enough accounts to take seriously. 3 months in a small group, far from family, doing hard work, with no communication possible. No way to know if someone back home was sick or in trouble. No way to send word or receive it. That isolation repeated season after season. Wore on people. We've talked about the experience from the cowboy's perspective. But the Chisholm Trail affected many other people as well. The farmers and settlers of Kansas who found themselves in the path of the trail had complicated feelings about the drives. Large herds of longhorn cattle could devastate crops, destroy fences, and contaminate water sources. The longhorns also carried a tick that spread a disease called Texas fever, which was lethal to domestic cattle in the north, even though longhorns were largely immune to it. Farmers who lost their domestic cattle to Texas fever weren't grateful for the trade that passed through their territory. This tension between the cattle trade and farming settlement was ultimately one of the forces that ended the Chisholm Trail era. As Kansas filled with homesteaders who fenced their land and fought to keep longhorns off their fields, the trail became harder to navigate and the political will to keep it open diminished. The cattle towns themselves evolved over time. Abilene's reign as the primary cattle town was relatively brief, roughly 1867 to 1872. As the railroad extended further west and south, new towns became the destination. Wichita, Ellsworth, Dodge City. The cattle trade moved to wherever the railroad was, and the towns rose and fell accordingly. The Chisholm Trail as a major cattle route was essentially over by the mid-1880s. A combination of factors ended it. Barbed wire changed the West profoundly. Invented in 1873, barbed wire became cheap and widely available through the late 1870s and 1880s. Farmers and ranchers fenced their land, and the open range that trail drives depended on began to disappear. You simply couldn't drive 2,000 cattle across a landscape that was increasingly divided by wire fences. The railroad expansion into Texas meant that cattle could be shipped directly from Texas rather than driven to Kansas. The whole reason for the long drive had been to reach the railroad. When the railroad came to you, the drive became unnecessary. The great die-ups of 1886 to 1887 were devastating. A catastrophic combination of drought, followed by one of the worst winters in memory, killed enormous numbers of cattle on the northern and southern plains. Many ranching operations were destroyed. The open range ranching system that had made the trail drives possible was badly damaged and never quite recovered. And the longhorn itself was being replaced. The beef markets wanted heavier, more tender cattle than the longhorn produced. Ranchers began crossbreeding with Hereford and Angus bulls, producing cattle that were more profitable per head but less capable of surviving the conditions of a long trail drive. By 1890, the era was over. The last significant drives up the Chisholm Trail route had already passed. The men who had ridden it were middle-aged or older, and the world around them had changed almost beyond recognition. The Chisholm Trail era lasted roughly 20 years at its peak. In that time, somewhere between 5 and 10 million cattle were driven north. Hundreds of millions of dollars flowed through the trade. The cities of the northern and eastern United States were fed in part by beef that had walked 800 miles to reach them. The cultural legacy was enormous and complicated and still shapes how Americans understand themselves. The cowboy figure became one of the most powerful cultural symbols in American history, representing independence, self-reliance, toughness, a certain freedom of the open country. This image was being mythologized almost as soon as it was being lived. Dime novels about cowboys were popular entertainment by the 1870s, while actual trail drives were still happening. The gap between the mythological cowboy and the working cowboy opened up almost immediately and has never fully closed. The mythology served certain purposes. It provided a narrative of American identity that was appealing, the individual against the wilderness, the free rider of the open range. It was used to sell everything from cigarettes to political philosophies. But it also systematically erased large portions of the actual story. The black cowboys who made up a significant fraction of the workforce. The Mexican vaqueros whose skills underpinned everything. The native peoples through whose land the drives passed. The complicated economic and social realities that the image of the lone cowboy conveniently simplified. The real history is richer and more interesting than the myth. It usually is. Some of the cowboys who rode the Chisholm Trail in the 1870s and 1880s lived long enough to be interviewed in the early 20th century, when historians and folklorists began realizing that the era was passing and the first-hand accounts needed to be preserved. These accounts are remarkable documents. They're matter-of-fact in ways that feel contemporary. The men who gave them were old by then, looking back on a very specific period of their lives with the clarity of distance. They remembered specific cattle and specific horses more often than you might expect. They remembered certain river crossings, certain storms, certain camps. They remembered good cooks and bad ones with equal intensity. They remembered the nights on watch under incredible skies full of stars, and they remembered how cold it got and how tired they were. Many of them said, in various ways, that it was the hardest work they ever did and that they wouldn't trade the experience for anything. That's a combination that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. The hardest things and the most meaningful things tend to overlap more than we'd sometimes like to admit. Let me try to give you a real picture of the landscape, because it matters. Starting in South Texas, the land is brushy and hot. Mesquite trees, prickly pear cactus, scattered live oaks. The grass in spring could be thick and green, which was good for the cattle's condition at the start of the drive. The weather was already warm when most drives began in March or April, and it got hotter quickly. Moving north through central Texas, the terrain flattened somewhat. The hill country region offered some dramatic topography, but the established trail routes generally avoided the worst of it. The land opened up into the rolling prairies that would characterize the drive for much of its length. Crossing into Indian territory at the Red River, the land didn't change dramatically at first. The Cross Timbers, a band of dense oak woodland that ran roughly north-south through the territory, presented a real challenge. Moving cattle through heavy brush was difficult and time-consuming. Getting through the Cross Timbers was an accomplishment that experienced trail bosses planned for carefully. Beyond the Cross Timbers, the territory opened into wider grasslands. The prairie here could be beautiful in ways that the accounts acknowledge, even while noting the hardships. In good spring weather, with grass thick and green and wildflowers blooming and the sky enormous overhead, this landscape had a genuine grandeur. Kansas, as the drives approached the state line, looked similar to the Oklahoma grasslands. The Flint Hills region that the trail passed through is still one of the finest remaining examples of tall grass prairie in North America. The grass here, big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, could grow taller than a man's waist in good years. It was rich, nutritious grass that cattle thrived on. And then, on the horizon, the low buildings of Abilene. Some fragments of what the men who rode this trail actually said have survived, and they're worth reflecting on. Old-time drovers interviewed decades later often circled back to the night sky. The absence of light pollution across the southern plains meant that the night sky was spectacular in ways that most people today genuinely cannot imagine. Multiple accounts mention the stars almost as a character in the story. The thing that made the long watches bearable. The thing that made a man feel both very small and part of something very large. They mentioned the sound of a large herd, a constant low sound of breathing and movement that was the background noise of their lives for months at a time. Men who spent years on the trail said they missed that sound when they left the life. They mentioned specific smells, the dust, the cattle, the coffee at dawn, the wood smoke of the camp. The overwhelming smell of a river crossing in summer heat, the clean smell of air after a thunderstorm. These sensory details anchor the experience in something real. This wasn't an abstraction or an idea. It was a physical, immediate, embodied experience that left marks on the people who went through it. It's worth spending a moment on why the mythology of the cowboy took hold so powerfully and why it has lasted so long. The trail drive era coincided almost exactly with a period when the United States was trying to figure out what kind of country it was becoming. The Civil War had settled certain fundamental questions and opened others. The country was industrializing rapidly. Cities were growing. The rural, agrarian way of life that had defined the nation's self-image was changing. The cowboy offered a story about a certain kind of American character, independent, capable, not beholden to anyone or any system, free to move across a wide landscape. That story was appealing precisely because the reality of American life was becoming less like that and more like factory work and urban tenements. The irony is that the actual cattle trade was thoroughly capitalist and thoroughly organized. The great cattle drives were commercial enterprises owned by men with money, run by hired workers for profit, integrated into a continental economy of railroads and meat-packing plants and eastern markets. The free-riding independent cowboy was actually an employee. But the image that stuck was the independent one, and that tells you something about what people needed the story to mean, regardless of what the story actually was. The Chisholm Trail's physical legacy is harder to trace than you might expect. Highways run over portions of it. Cities have grown up along it. The land has changed with farming, development, and the absence of the massive bison herds that once shaped the prairie landscape. But some traces remain. In the Flint Hills of Kansas, some of the original trail route can still be identified. There are markers and monuments along the way. In Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, marking the passage of those drives. Museums in various trail towns preserve the material culture of the era. The Oklahoma section of the trail runs through what is now the sovereign territory of the Cherokee Nation and other tribal nations, whose relationship to this history is complex and whose presence in the story deserves acknowledgement. Abilene has a museum dedicated to the cattle drive era. Wichita celebrates its cattle town history. Dodge City has built an entire tourism identity around the cowboy period. And the longhorn itself? The breed was nearly extinct by the early 20th century, reduced to a handful of animals in a federal preserve. Conservation efforts beginning in the 1920s saved the breed, and today The Texas longhorn is a recognized breed with dedicated breeders and a passionate following. They're used in parades and exhibitions and on ranches where people appreciate their durability and their connection to history. So let me pull this all together, because I think the full picture is worth sitting with for a moment. What did it actually take to move 2,000 cattle 800 miles across the 1870s American plains? It took months of preparation. Gathering the herd, assembling the crew, provisioning the Chuck Wagon. It took physical toughness that modern people genuinely struggle to relate to. Long days in the saddle, broken sleep, hard physical work in heat and cold and rain. It took a specific body of knowledge that took years to develop. Reading cattle, reading weather, reading landscape, managing both animals and people. It took courage of a particular kind. Not the dramatic courage of a moment, but the sustained daily courage of continuing with difficult work across months of accumulated difficulty. That kind of courage is quieter than the movie version, and in some ways more impressive. It took collaboration. The trail drive worked because each person did their job. The cook, the drag riders, the night watch, the trail boss. The whole operation depended on everyone pulling their weight because there wasn't enough slack in the system for passengers. And it took luck. Everything we've described assumed things went more or less as planned. When they didn't, and they often didn't, men and animals died. Herds were lost, outfits failed. The element of luck in who made it to Abilene and who didn't was real and not to be minimized. Here's what I keep coming back to when I think about the Chisholm Trail era. This was a genuinely significant episode in American history that shaped the country in concrete, lasting ways. It fed a growing nation. It contributed to the economic development of the West. It influenced American culture in ways that are still visible today. And it was done by working men. And some women, though that's a story for another time. Most of whom had no particular historical ambitions. They were doing a job. A hard job. A sometimes dangerous job. But a job. They weren't trying to create an era. They were trying to get 2,000 cattle from Texas to Kansas before the season ended. The historical significance was something that accumulated from thousands of ordinary decisions and ordinary days. There's something worth noting in that. History isn't usually made by people who know they're making history. It's made by people who are trying to get through the day. The cowboys of the Chisholm Trail were trying to get through the day, through the heat and the storms and the river crossings and the long night watches. And in doing so, they became part of something that we're still talking about 150 years later. If you could go back and spend a day on the Chisholm Trail, a single day, somewhere in the middle of the drive, somewhere in the Indian Territory with the grass thick and green and the sky huge overhead, what would you want to know? Would it match the image you already had in your head? Probably not entirely. It would be harder and quieter and more ordinary than the movie suggested. The work would be more tedious and more skillful at the same time. The people would be more diverse and more human than the simplified version of the story allows. But something about it would probably land differently than you expected. That sky, that sound, that sense of being genuinely out in the country, days from anything that could be called civilization, responsible for 2,000 animals and 8 or 10 people and all the decisions that would get them through. There's a reason the men who did this work remembered it the way they did. There's a reason it stayed with them. The Chisholm Trail era was brief, barely 20 years at its peak, but it left marks that lasted. On the land, on the economy, on the culture, and on the people who rode it. And now you know a little more about what those marks actually came from. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of history that deserves careful attention, and I'm glad you spent some time with it today. If you found this interesting, there's a lot more territory to cover, literally and figuratively. We haven't talked about the women of the cattle drive era. or the specific stories of some of the black cowboys whose contributions were real and largely uncelebrated, or the vaquero tradition that made all of this possible, or what happened to the men who rode the trail when the trail ended. Any one of those threads could fill its own video. Let me know in the comments which direction you'd like to go next. Drop a like if you found this worth your time, and subscribe if you want to keep coming back to stories like this one, because there's no shortage of history worth knowing. And we're just getting started.